Last time, we're not going to really start in yet. Somebody asked me about what poets I recommend reading in difficult times, and I quoted, and I didn't quote accurately, so I have it for you here accurately. It's a very, very short poem by Bertolt Brecht. Brecht he's best known as a dramatist. And since I don't understand drama too well, I can't judge him on that, but he was a wonderful poet. He was really one of the great poets of the 20th century. He was a communist and he identified very strongly with the working class. And he wrote poems that were bitter and acerbic at times. And his poems are often very short. And this is one of the very shortest of them. It's called Motto. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful. Let me see if I can get that slideshow from current slide. So that's Bertolt Brecht, and I think one of the mysteries of human life is that human beings in the dark times, whenever they are, for whatever reason, people write poems and compose music. I have another friend who's a pianist who specializes in a number of things, but one of them is music of the Holocaust. People who were in concentration camps wrote music until the moment of their dying. And it's just astonishing how people want to make beauty and meaning out of the world, even if the times are as hard as they can be. Having said that, we'll enter into, if I can, into the poems we're going to read for today. I call these walking around poems. That's my name for them, and Corey mentioned it last time. I guess there's a real name for them literarily. They're poems about, now I forget, the name has escaped me. Anyway, I'll think of it in a second. But they're walking around poems. Some of the greatest poems are about poets taking a walk and writing what they think about when they walk, including Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth and Book One of the Prelude. I think the Prelude is one of the greatest poems of all time. And Book One is its most wonderful part. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry by Walt Whitman. Whitman loved to ride the public transport of the time, and Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is a strange kind of walking around poem. He rides on the ferry, so it's about him standing on the ferry as it goes back and forth across the harbor. He's not actually moving so much, but the ferry is moving, and it is a stunning, stunning, wonderful poem. I think the greatest of all the walking around poems is something called the Duino Elegies, and it's not really about walking around. It was written. I'll tell you a little story about it because we're about to begin. Rainer Maria Rilke, who I may have mentioned before, was a very odd poet. He was his mother dressed him as a girl until he was 5. His father didn't much care for him. He was unbelievably aesthetic, which doesn't appeal to me. He wanted to talk about beauty and art all the time. He was a great mooch. He really didn't own any houses. He just lived in houses that his rich friends loaned to him. One of the Duino Elegies is about a Picasso that hung on the wall in the house that he lived in Paris. He married a woman and had a child with her, but he really married her because he wanted to marry somebody else at the same artist colony, but she married somebody else. So anyway, they split up and neither of them wanted to take the kid, and a lot of reasons to dislike Rilke. But one day he was staying, once again, mooching, staying in a castle owned by his friend Marie von Thurn and Taxis on the Adriatic. He was walking on a cliff outside the castle and trying to compose in his head a business letter that he had to write. And all of a sudden he heard a voice in his head saying, If I cried out now, this is not literal, but it's very close. If I cried out now, who among the angels would hear me? Well, I would never do that because I don't think about angels, and I don't. But anyway, he was walking around, and those were the first lines of a poem that became the Duino elegies. And he went back to his room and he wrote down that poem. And in the next few days, in a storm of creativity, he wrote three or four more. And then came, and this is one of the great, great mysteries, I think, in all of art, then came a curtain down over Rilke's creativity. It was late in the First World War, and then it was a post-war period. And for 8 years, Rilke didn't write any poems. And then he was living in a tower. He actually bought a tower in Switzerland, so he had his own place. And all of a sudden, he said, you know, I can finish these Duino elegies. And so he wrote, there are 10 of them. He finished those that were incomplete, and he wrote the others. And he said, oh, and at the same time, I have some sonnets I think I want to write. And he wrote something called the Sonnes d'Orpheus. And as one literary critic said, there's never been a storm of creativity in the history of human beings like that. In the space of a month, he wrote what I think is the greatest of all poetic sequences, the Duino elegies, which started out as a walking around poem, and the Sonnes d'Orpheus. And then he was kind of exhausted and died. The Desert Music is a poem by William Carlos Williams, one of my favorite poets, in which he's had a stroke and he's traveled to California and he's riding back on the railroad, and he gets off in El Paso, and he goes over the bridge to Ciudad Juarez to meet some old friends for lunch. So it's a poem about the walk he takes, and it's I think one of the most stunning poems of the 20th century. It's about 10 or 12 pages. It's a walking around poem. And as I've already told you that his colleague, I'm not sure they were friends, they certainly weren't enemies, Wallace Stevens, composed most of his poems while he walked around at lunch hour. And they have a certain rhythm to them, although they're not mostly about walking. And that brings us to Frank O'Hara, who wrote a short book called Lunch Poems. And they're like poems that he wrote when he went out for lunch. Here's a wonderful quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, just because famous people say it doesn't mean they're great things, but he did say this. I think it's great. All truly great thoughts are conceived while walking. There is something about walking around, about walking and having a rhythm of one foot in front of another, which maybe matches up with, in some way, the rhythms that course through our bodies of breathing. You know, we breathe in and out, and our hearts beat 60 to 80 times a minute. So there are all sorts of rhythms, and I think the rhythm of walking kind of syncs with those and allows our thoughts to float a little bit more freely than if we're sitting at a desk. And we'll see that, I think, in the poem Corson's Inlet, which is about walking and about how thoughts move more freely. So here's Frank O'Hara. Frank O'Hara's story is a little bit of a tragedy. He was a critic of art, of painting art, and he was worked for the Museum of Modern Art. And as you perhaps know, in the 1950s, when he was writing art criticism, the great movement was abstract expressionism. And a lot of that had to do with the painting being a record of the time at the moment of its creation. So if you know the paintings of Jackson Pollock, who will come up in one of these poems, and I don't have a Pollock painting for you here. Pollock made these drip paintings, and really the drip paintings were the record in drips on canvas of the movements of his arm at the time of his painting of them. So there's a kind of contemporaneity about O'Hara's poems. And we're going to look at two of his poems because they're so clearly walking about poems, and probably on his lunch hour in both of them. In fact, clearly in his lunch hour, and one eats a cheeseburger and another eats a hamburger. This is called A Step Away from Them. And the title is a little odd, but I think it'll become more clear when we get near the end of it. And it begins he's very conversational in his poems. And this is a very New Yorky poem. You can feel the New York seeping through this. Couldn't be written in any other city in the world. It's my lunch hour, so I go for a walk among the hum-colored cabs. First, down the sidewalk where laborers feed their dirty, glistening torso sandwiches and Coca-Cola with yellow helmets on to protect them from falling bricks, I guess. Then onto the avenue where skirts are flipping above heels. I think we think of that famous photo of Marilyn Monroe on a subway grating with her skirt flying up as the warm air from the subway comes out. Then onto the avenue where skirts are flipping above heels and blow up over grates. The sun is hot, but the cabs stir up the air. I look at bargains and wristwatches. There are cats playing in sawdust. And what you can see in these lines is the series of things that he observes. He sees workmen with yellow hats, and he sees a skirt flipping up, and he feels the hot sun, but the cabs are moving slowly, and he's looking at wristwatches for sale on the street or maybe in a store window, and there are cats playing in sawdust. And then he's going to refer in this next passage. Some of you may have gone to New York long ago when Times Square was not what it is today, and there was a famous waterfall there above the Bond advertisement, below the Pepsi-Cola advertisement, and also a Camel ad where the smoker had different pictures of smokers would puff out puffs of Camel, and they'll recur in the poem, and you can see them both here, the Camel ad and the waterfall here. And this here is perhaps a luncheonette of the sort that he stops in to get his cheeseburger. On Times Square, where the sign blows smoke over my head and higher the waterfall pours lightly, a Negro stands in the doorway with a toothpick languorously agitating. A blonde chorus girl clicks. He smiles and rubs his chin. Everything suddenly honks. It is 12:40 of a Thursday. So we have the day and the time and the people he sees and the signs. And then he turns, and you'll notice we're starting to get capitals. It's a little like he is anticipating Andy Warhol with his paintings of the objects of daily life that we encounter. Warhol famously did Brillo boxes and so forth. Neon in daylight is a great pleasure, as this is his friend, the poet, as Edwin Denby would write, as are light bulbs in daylight. So it's all lit up even though it's daylight. I stopped for a cheeseburger at Juliet's Corner. Giulietta Messina, wife of Federico Fellini e Bellatrice, and chocolate malted. A lady in foxes on such a day puts her poodle in the cab. I'm going to stop here and just look at what happens. He's thinking as he walks along on his lunch hour. They call lunch poems. He thinks of his friend Edward Denby writing about neon being wonderful in the daylight, and he thinks, there are lights on, and that's pretty wonderful too. And I'm going to have a cheeseburger and a malted, but in between the cheeseburger and the malted, Juliet's Corner, the name of the small kind of restaurant, it's not even a restaurant, it's a little cafe by a corner, reminds him of the name of an actress. A Bellatrice is Italian for it's a beautiful, a wonderful actress, of Giulietta Messina, who's the wife of the famous Italian theater director Federico Fellini. So we have the cheeseburger and the thoughts, seeing the name of the place where he's buying it, of the actress, and then he goes to the malted he has with the cheeseburger, and then he goes to a lady in foxes on such a day. It's a hot day, remember? People are sweating. Puts her poodle in a cab. So we have a whole cross section of workers to wealthy people in fox wraps, and he's eating a cheeseburger. There's several Puerto Ricans on the avenue today, which makes it beautiful and warm. First, Bunny died. then Latouche, then Jackson Pollock. But is the earth as full of life was full of them? And I want to stop here because I think there are many ways to read this poem. It's a poem about walking around and taking in what comes at him. This is what the Parisians would call a flaneur. Flaneur is a wanderer, and the great literary critic and theorist Walter Benjamin thought that the great poet of the 19th century was Charles Baudelaire, who lived in Paris, and he thought his poems were really wanderings through Paris. He was a flaneur. And so the walking about poem has its roots in the modern city for Walter Benjamin. So this is a walking about poem in which he sees the things around him, but I think it's also an elegy. An elegy is a poem commemorating people who died, and people who died perhaps young and at an untimely moment in their life. And as I have put in the note down here, Bunny was a friend of his, a woman who'd gone to Harvard, and she died of cancer at an early age. John Latouche was a lyricist, that is, he wrote songs for musical comedies, and he wrote musical comedies, and he actually wrote an opera lyric, and he died also early. He died in Vermont, of all places, in the Northeast Kingdom. And Jackson Pollock, who was one of the founders and mainstays of abstract expressionism, also died early. And I think this lament, but is the earth as full of, as life was full of them, it is a profound lament in this poem. This world that he's going through is full of cheeseburgers and of names of cafes and of people in yellow hats and women in fox stoles, but really the world is impoverished because of the people who've died and left it. And I think that is what he thinks of as he walks on, but the poem isn't over. And notice how I think in his poems we want to be very, very careful to notice small changes. He's moved in from this, from the first person, I stop for a cheeseburger, to having thought of these dead friends, he's moved to an impersonal, and one has eaten. He's had a cheeseburger and a malted, and one walks past the magazine with fights and posters for bullfight and the Manhattan Storage Warehouse, which they'll soon tear down. I used to think they had the Armory show there. So we back to the assertion of the self. But for a moment, faced with death and loss, he merges into an impersonal third person. One has eaten and one walks. He is disconnected from himself, even though he still is walking and observing. So then after having had his cheeseburger and malted, he has a glass of papaya juice and back to work. My heart is in my pocket. It is poems by Pierre Reverdy. So the poem documents what happens on this walk through the city, but as I said, I think it is really organized around these lines. First Bunny died, then Latouche, then Jackson Pollock, but is the earth as full as life was full of them? This is his most famous poem. It's called The Day Lady Died, and it's a bit of a pun on the nickname of Billie Holiday, who was known as Lady Day. So The Day Lady Died is a pun on Lady Day, and you can see in this autograph picture, she signs herself Lady Day right there. And notice how he starts. It's another walking around poem. He's walking around, and he, as it turns out in this poem, he's walking to the station to take a train out to Long Island, where he'll spend the weekend with friends and eat dinner with people he doesn't even know. He's going to buy some presents for his friends who he's going to stay with. And it's very factual at the beginning. It's going to come in contrast to what happens at the end. It's 12:20 in New York. a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Okay, so we know it's July 17th, 1220, New York, 1959. And I go get a shoe shine because he'll be off on the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15. So the train leaves the station to go out to Long Island, to East Hampton, and it leaves at 4:19. He'll be there at 7:15, and they go straight to dinner and don't know the people who will feed me. Now, before we go further, I want you to notice, unlike the last poem, and like the Ammons poem, there's not a period in this poem until we get to the very end. It's all one long sentence. That sense of contemporaneity, that sense of being in the middle of things and things just going on and on and on. The conjunction "and" rather than the full stop of period is what links things together. So he's waiting for the train, and he stops, and here's some pictures of what's going to come. He looks at New World writing and wants to see what the latest African writers are writing, and then he buys a book of Verlaine poems illustrated by the French poet, French painter Pierre Bonnard. Here's a page from that book, and he buys that instead of buying Hesiod, who is a Greek poet who wrote works in Days and Theogony, or a play by Jean Genet, who's a very au courant playwright of the time, a French writer, Le Balcon, or maybe Brendan Behan's latest play, which probably is The Hostage, or maybe another Irish au courant poet of the day. I walk up the muggy street, beginning to sun, and have a hamburger and a malted, right? Just like the last poem. It's his lunch poem. He's having lunch. I have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, which I think is a bookshop, couldn't find a picture of it, and in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod trans Richmond Lattimore or Brendan Behan's new play, or Le Balcon, Les Nègres of Genet, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with quandariness. So he's tried to figure out what to get for these people, and he's bought, and notice how it's in caps, their objects, which are defined in their objecthood by their names. And then he's going to think of what to bring for Mike, and he's going to buy him a bottle of Strega, which is an Italian liquor. Not a hard choice. And then, because he's going for the weekend and he wants cigarettes to smoke, he's going to buy these fancy artsy cigarettes, Gauloises, which are French, and Picayunes, which are from New Orleans. Maybe one carton is for himself, one for the people he's visiting. And then he sees, and this is a copy of the Post of that day, Billie Holiday dies. Billie Holiday was a famous jazz singer. And for Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back where I came from to 6th Avenue. We can chart his moving around, right? He's gone from the station to the bookstore to the Park Lane liquor store, then back to 6th Avenue, and to the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually asked for a carton of Gauloises and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And let me go back to that. There it is. That's what he sees. And then this breathtaking, literally breathtaking last stanza. This is the Blue Note, which is a jazz club in New York City. This is a portrait of a jazz band playing in it. And here is Mal Waldron, the pianist, and Billie Holiday. And he's going to be playing. He remembers back as he sees her picture in the paper. He remembers when he heard her singing to him playing on the keyboard. And here's this last stanza. I don't know if poetry gets better than this. And yet it's not in fancy language. And I'm sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron and everyone, and I stopped breathing. And I think we'll start with that last phrase, that stopping breathing is both everyone in the five spot, including him, stop breathing to listen to her whisper the song as if she's alone with the pianist Mal Waldron. So they stopped breathing. There was this expectant hush in the air as she sang the song, and that's the memory he has. And also he realizes that he's come to an ending in his life. There's no going back. Billie Holiday is dead. And so he stops breathing. He's just stunned by what has happened. This is in the present. The stopping breathing in the past was when he was listening to her. And I'm sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John Doerr in the five spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron and everyone, and I stopped breathing. So there's this ambiguity of this last line of stopping breathing at the extraordinary quality of her whispering a song to her pianist, and also stopping breathing in the present as he realizes, if I can go back, that Billie Holiday has died. They're both poems about walking around. And now we come to another poem, much more, they're contemporaries. I don't know that they knew each other. They're both in the present, although Ammons is thinking about things more and not just recording sensations as much as Frank O'Hara. There's Ammons. Ammons is a strange guy for a poet. You know, we had some strange poets in the 20th century in America. Wallace Stevens was an insurance lawyer, and William Carlos Williams was a pediatrician and general practitioner in New Jersey. This man, A.R. Ammons, who everybody called Archie because his first name was Archibald, grew up on a tobacco farm, quite poor in North Carolina. He went and served in the military on the GI Bill. He went to college. He got a college degree, got an MA in English from Berkeley, and then he became a principal in a small school in Eastern North Carolina, got married. His wife's father owned a chemical glass factory. That is, they made test tubes and retorts and things for chemists, and he was a salesman for them for 15 or 20 years, wrote poems. And when they gave a reading at Cornell University, and I think they knew they had an extraordinary poet, they offered him a job, and then he eventually became professor of poetry at Cornell. That's another picture of A.R. Ammons. Now, I want to, before we jump into this poem, Corson's Inlet, I want to kind of do a deep dive into physics of all things. Here's this man named Werner Heisenberg. Strange man. He grew up in Germany. He was accused of being a white Jew, which meant that he wasn't Jewish, but they thought he was like Jewish because he hung out with all these Jewish physicists. Then he worked on the Nazi war effort. I mean, he's a mixed bag of a guy. He was one of the great physicists of the 20th century, one of the founders of quantum mechanics. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize, which he won in 1932. He was nominated by none other than Albert Einstein. And one of the things that Heisenberg did, and the thing for which most of us who are not physicists remember him, is he came up with something called the uncertainty principle. He didn't like that name, and he preferred the indeterminacy principle. Heisenberg believed that the world didn't exist independent of our observation of it. And he had this very kind of, to my mind, simple. I had a friend, a roommate long ago who was a mathematician who thought that Heisenberg was all about the formula. And I think my roommate Jimmy was right, but I don't know formulas, so I know this. He said if you have a small particle like an electron and you measure its spin, you alter its location. And if you measure its location, you alter its spin or its speed. So the act of measurement of measuring one thing alters another thing. And you can never know for certain what anything is because the act of measuring transforms what you're measuring so that you can't measure more than one thing at a time. That's the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle. So that it says, as this says, there's a limit to the precision to which certain pairs of physical properties, such as position and momentum, place and energy, can be simultaneously known. In other words, the more accurately one property is measured, the less accurately the other property can be known. That is, if you look at something carefully, you transform it. We had a poem in the first semester, those of you who look at British poets with me, by Wordsworth, in which he says, we murder to dissect. If we want to look at the innards of things, we cut them open, and in cutting them open, we kill them, and we see their livers, but the liver isn't functioning anymore. So the reason I bring up Heisenberg is that since Heisenberg, we have lived in a world which, to a great many people, seems indeterminate. The more we try to find out the truth, the more we find that the truth is somehow not knowable. It's what resides behind many of the movements we've had to try and understand the world in the 20th century. So we'll leave that behind and we'll go to the poem. Corson's Inlet is, I realized in rereading it many times for this class, is an Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica is the title of a poem by the Latin poet Horace, and it refers to a poem that is about poetry. Ars Poetica means the art of poetry. So the poem is about what it means to be a poem and what it means to be a poet. And I think that's what this poem is about more than I had first thought. And I would quote you in this regard the first a line that occurs fairly early in the poem, in the first page of it that I sent out to you. He's wandering along, and I'll get to that in a moment. And he says, in the overall wandering of mirroring mind, his mind is a mirror to what he sees. That is, he is in some ways an Emersonian. Emerson said, every natural fact is a symbol of a spiritual fact. So when he goes through the world and looks at what he sees, he realizes he's looking at what he writes poems about. He mirrors the world in which he walks. Corson's Inlet is actually an inlet in New Jersey. There it is. You can see it's inlet from the ocean. It's where a stream kind of goes around. It makes its bends and goes around and exits in the ocean. There's another picture of it. And I think in the poem we'll find he walks along the beach and then along the inlet's inner shore, along there. And so he's walking along this. It's nice to read this poem with a sense of where he's walking. So there's another picture of the inlet, and he goes on a path. He says he goes on a path, and there are bayberries. We'll get to a berry in a minute. Those are probably bayberries. He's walking through the plants that are on the dunes besides the inlet. And you'll see birds looking for prey, for mussels. There's a bird, a shorebird. There's a gull diving in to catch a crab or a mussel. There'll be a bird that he can't quite make out in the poem what it's catching. He'll talk about a white-legged egret. There's one kind of in the distance. And in the poem, the egret jabs at something. He's not sure what it is. He thinks maybe it's a hermit crab, but he's not sure. And as he walks, he sees tree swallows, just a huge number of swallows, which are feeding on the berries by the shore, the bayberries. There they are flying, kind of a mass of them without order, and yet they will have, in a sense, some kind of order. And there are bayberries as they grow. The bayberries are grow on a bush that can take some salt water and still grow happily. And these are the berries that they bear. And he'll talk, this is only in passing, it's not important. He'll talk about primula primrose. He's probably looking at the leaves and not at the flowers, but there are the flowers and the leaves, and they grow along the shore. And in fact, they grow in our garden here in Vermont. And here are the birds rising in the air above the berries they've been feeding on. And that takes us to the poem. This is the opening of the poem, Corson's Inlet. What we notice as we read the poem is that it's in free verse, right? The first line is, I think, 14 syllables long. The second line is 3 syllables long. The fourth line is 2 syllables long. And there's no kind of, there's no equality of accents or syllables in the lines. And not only that, it doesn't seem to rhyme. Although I looked at it closely, and yeah, well, it rhymes more than we think. Morning and along, sea and surf, headland and returned. So they're kind of like slant rhymes. And I asked myself as I looked at this, was he aware that he's doing these rhymes? These half rhymes, these slant rhymes? I don't know. I think the words just sounded right to him. And so morning and along and sea and surf and headland and returned, I think they pick up on recurrences like the recurrence of his walking. Now, before we go further, we'll also notice that the lines and their indentations mirror his walking. Remember, he said the overall mirroring of the mirroring mind. I went for a walk over the dunes again this morning to the sea. Big thing, so short line. Then turned right along the surf, and notice the line turns, rounded a naked headland, and returned along the inside shore. So inlet shore. So that the lines are kind of mimicking what he's doing as he walks, or as the great architect Frank Lloyd Wright would say, form follows function. The form of this poem follows what he's doing. So he's going for a walk on the dunes and turns right and goes along a naked headland and return along the inlet shore. And we're going to stop and look closely at these next lines. It was muggy, sunny, the wind from the sea steady and high, crisp in the running sand, some breakthroughs of sun, but a bit continuous overcast. And if I ask you, he's talking about the weather. What's the weather? It's hard to tell. It's sunny, muggy sunny, means it's kind of East Coast, not West Coast, dry sunny, but East Coast. Summer, late summer, it's going to turn out it's going to be close to fall. Sunny with a little muggy, so it's sunny. The wind from the sea, steady and high. Well, that's not even clear. Crisp in the running sand, clear. Some breakthroughs of sun. Well, it's not so sunny, just the sun breaks through. But after a bit, continuous overcast. So what we have in these 5 lines is a sunny day that is intermittently sunny and then it's overcast. It's sun and then not sun. Things are in the process of change and are not definable as a sunny day or an overcast day. And I think that sets us up for the whole poem. You've got the whole poem right there. That things can't be defined because they're in the process of change, and that things shift into other things. These are among my favorite lines in the poem. The walk liberating, right? He's walking along and he finds it liberating. And I want you to notice here before we go further, the beginning of the poem is in the past tense. I went for a walk, I was released from forms, and now here, because I think he realizes the walk is an ars poetica, he's going to talk in the present tense. I allow. I was released, I allow. So he's gone from the past into the present. The walk liberating, I was released from forms, from the perpendiculars, straight lines, blocks, boxes, binds of thought, into the hues, shadings, rises, flowing, bends, and blends of sight. And I greatly love those lines because I think he's saying to us that when we think, we categorize, we put things in boxes. We have straight lines, it is or it is not. We make blocks of them. This is my this thought, and this is my other thought. And he says, when we walk through the world, when we sense the world, we get things that are not so precise. Hues, shadings, rises, flowing bends and blends of sight. And I thought about this, I think it would be any of the sense impressions. If we were hearing sounds would shade into other sounds. And if he were touching, one touch would blend into another touch. So it's that blend here, that shading, the hues, the not strict lines, this is red, this is white, but rather this is red bleeding into pink, going into paler pink, going into yellowish pink, going into pale yellow, going into whitish yellow. It's those hues of sight that he's concentrating on, that he's moved from, he's been liberated, right? That's the word he uses, liberated from the straight lines and the perpendiculars of thought to the hues and the shadings and a little of this and a little of that and all mixed together of seeing. So he goes on walking along the shore and he says, I allow myself eddies, little circular flows that don't go as the stream flows, but little whirlpools in the stream. I allow myself eddies of meaning, yield to a direction of significance running like a stream through the geography of my work. You can see here that he's turning into an ars poetica. He circles around in his work, and although his work has a direction of significance that goes in a certain direction, still there's a lot of mushing around, these eddies that go on. You can find in my sayings swerves of action, like the inlet's cutting edge. So he's comparing what he writes and what he's seeing. It's called Corson's Inlet, the inlet's edge. There are dunes of motion, organizations of grass, white sandy paths of remembrance, and the overall wandering of mirroring mind. Now let's again slow down and look at this. Swerves of action like the inlet's cutting edge. There are dunes of motion. In a couple of stanzas, he's going to tell us that the dunes are always changing, that the dunes are there, but as you know, if you've been to the ocean, the wind passes over the dunes and it blows the sand a little bit, and tomorrow the dune will be a little different than the dune is today. There's a very famous pre-Socratic philosopher. Pre-Socratic means before Socrates. And the pre-Socratics were enamored of the four basic elements of human existence: air, water, earth, and fire. And Heraclitus was the philosopher of fire, of transmutation. He believed in change. He famously said, in the same river we both step and cannot step. Or he said in another famous saying, he said, I cannot step in the same river twice, because the river is there, but it's always moving, so the water is always different, so it's never the same. It's both the same river, but a different river. And there are dunes of motion, organizations of grass, white sandy paths of remembrance, in the overall wandering of mirroring mind. Now, let me stop here and notice I've said this is a poem without a period until we get to the very end. There is a colon here, and there are colons throughout the poem. Here's another colon. And you'll notice that he comes up against things and then kind of swerves into something else. The colon is like a stop. It's not a full stop, end, stop, let's start over again, as with a period. It's a pause, and let's start from where we are, maybe in a different direction. And as you will see throughout this poem, it's littered with colons. He does use some commas, as in here, but mostly his punctuation is colons. So his mind mirrors what he is seeing. He sees eddies of significance along the edge of the inlet. He sees eddies, and he thinks, oh, my poems are like eddies, and the dunes are there, but they are always moving, and so are my poems. And there are organizations of grass. We'll get to that in a moment. That is, the grass is both there and also not quite there. It's an organization of grass, not a lawn. And he's wandering along with his wandering mind, this overall wandering of mirroring mind. He mirrors what he sees, but he says, overall, capital O, is beyond me. The sum of these events I cannot draw, the ledger I cannot keep, the accounting beyond the account. He can't quite get the sense of the whole of it. He can only get the pieces, the hues and shadings he encounters. In nature, remember what he said before? He said, I'm going to read this to you. The walk liberating, I was released from forms from the perpendicular straight lines, blocks, boxes, binds of thought into the hues, shadings, rises, flowing, bends, and blends of sight. He says here in nature, there are few sharp lines. There are areas of primrose more or less dispersed. So there's more primrose there, and there's less primrose here. Disorderly orders of bayberry. Well, there are a lot of bayberry there, but they're not in neat rows. They just happen to grow. It's a line I love by Wallace Stevens, which I may cite again. He says, happens to like is one of the ways things happen to fall. Things just happen. And so the bayberry, which has an order, look, that's a bayberry patch over there, is disordered because it, as we try and figure out how it makes sense, they just grow. Between the rows of dunes, irregular swamps of reeds, though not reeds alone, but grass, bayberry, yarrow, all predominantly reeds. It's quite stunning what he's doing there. Between the dunes, there's reeds, and then there's a lot of other stuff, but it's mostly reeds. So we have the equivalent of hues. It's reeds, and there's something more than reeds, even though it is mostly reeds, predominantly reeds. I've reached no conclusions, have erected no boundaries, shutting out and shutting in, separating inside from outside. I have drawn no lines. Right? And he said, I quoted again here in Brown, the walk liberating, I was released from forms from the perpendiculars, straight lines, blocks, boxes, binds of thought into the lines, the hues, shadings, rises, flowing, bends, and blends of sight. I have drawn no lines. There's nothing but hues here. Manifold events of sand change a dune's shape that will not be the same shape tomorrow. We've already talked about that. The dune, as the sand blows and reconfigures, will be a slightly different dune tomorrow, just as the creek will be a different creek tomorrow or even 10 seconds from now. In the same water I can step and cannot step, says Heraclitus. And so I'm willing to go along to the fact that everything is changing and that nothing is set and nothing is settled and that there aren't lines and blocks and boxes. I'm willing to go along to accept the becoming thought, that which is in the process of becoming, to stake off no beginnings or ends, to establish no walls. Again, we are, if I can go back to that, no straight lines, blocks, boxes, pines of thought. By transition, the land falls from grassy dunes to creek to undercreek, but there are no lines, though change in that transition is clear as any sharpness, but sharpness spread out. And you have a sense of how extraordinary he is as he tells us this. Sharpness means for most of us clear, with clear delineation, and for him, sharpness is a sharpness spread out, allowed to occur over a wider range than mental lines can keep. So the grassy dunes kind of become the creek, and the creek kind of becomes what is underneath the creek, and there are no lines here. Things are in movement. Now, you might tell me, well, the creek has its defined boundaries, and I might say yes, but this is a creek by the ocean, and we're going to see in a moment that the ocean and its shoreline is in continual, in the process of continual change. So that's why it's not quite like the creek we normally encounter. So last night, there's a full moon. When there's a full moon, it exerts a stronger pressure on the tides than when there's a partial moon. The moon was full last night. Today, low tide was low. So the tide is very low. And being very low, it exposes the mussels which grow on the rocks, which are mostly underwater, even at low tide. Today, low tide was low. Black shoals of mussels exposed to the risk of air and earlier of sun waved in and out with the waterline inexact, caught always in the event of change. I mentioned before, this is not your typical creek within a defined boundary. This is a waterline that is changing as the tide goes in and out, as the waves gently move in and out upon the shore. And he sees these flats of mussels which are exposed and are at risk of dying and drying out, with the sun, the risk of air and earlier of sun. Caught always in the event of change. The change is, everything is always changing as the tide is changing, as the moon goes through its phases, as the water from the ocean comes in slowly and goes out slowly. A young mottled gull stood free on the shoals and ate to vomiting. Mottled is what young gulls are, brown and white. And when they get older, they become white. So it's mottled because it's a young gull. But it also indicates another indication of time and growth and change that is here in the poem. And because the mussels are exposed, the gull doesn't have to search for them. They're there just right beneath his feet, and he just eats and eats and eats to vomiting, eats as much as he possibly can. Another gull, squawking possession, cracked a crab, picked out the entrails, swallowed the soft shell legs, a ruddy turnstone running in to snatch leftover bits. So another seagull has caught a crab and cracked it open and eaten the soft parts out of it and eaten its legs. And this turnstone, this little bird that goes in and out along the sea, it rushes in and eats what's been left over by the gull. And then this stunning line: risk is full, every living thing in siege. The demand is life, to keep life. So what he sees as he is still walking are these flats of mussels that have been exposed by the very, very low tide. And he sees that everything is in danger of being consumed and in fact dying, going through that ultimate metamorphosis. Every living thing in siege, risk is full. Demand is life to keep life. That's why this mottled gull keeps eating almost about vomiting, so it can stay alive and eat, and the muscle MUSSEL turns into muscle MUSCLE in the bird's wings. The small, and now he looks out and he sees the small white black-legged egret, how beautiful, quietly stalks and spears the shallows, darts to shore to stab. What? I couldn't see against the black mud flats, a frightened fiddler crab. So as in that picture I had of the gull going down on the mud flats, he can't quite see what the bird has got, but it's got something. Everything eats something, and this is in a sense, a Darwinian poem. This is not a poem in which nature is kind and beneficent. Things eat things. Risk is full. Every living thing in siege. Demand is life to keep life. And his attention turns, if I can go back. He has a couple of question marks. And then he turns here, he says, oh, on my left, as I'm walking along, I see there are a lot of birds and they're feeding on bayberries. The news to my left over the dunes and reeds and bayberry clumps. Remember, we had reeds, mostly reeds, and bayberry clumps, indeterminate, but they are berries, was full, thousands of tree swallows gathering for flight. An order held in constant change, a congregation rich with entropy, nevertheless separable, noticeable as one event, not chaos. And what I want you to notice here is how abstract his language has become. An order held in constant change, a congregation rich with entropy. Entropy is a law of physics. It's the tendency of all matter to go to a more disordered state, less energetic state. Nevertheless separable, noticeable as one event, not chaos. So it's not chaotic, even though these birds are here and they're just, all together like we saw in those pictures, preparations for flight from winter. And now, having been so abstract, he gets very, very concrete. The birds are chittering, right? Cheat, 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 cheat. Wings rifling the green clumps, beaks at the bayberries. So we've gone from this very abstract order of words, an order held in constant change, a congregation rich with entropy, nevertheless separable, noticeable as one event, not chaos. Preparations for flight from winter, cheat, 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 cheat. Wings rifling the green clumps, beaks at the bayberries. A perception full of wind, flight, curve, sound, the possibility of rule as a sum of rulelessness, the field of action with moving, incalculable center. So there's no rule that's determining how these birds jump from branch to branch and eat berries. And the field of action, this field that he sees in front of him where things are moving, doesn't somehow have a center. It just is this bunch of birds that keep moving. And we'll get to the birds in a moment again, but first he's going to say, I can find order here if I look down close. In the smaller view, order tight with shape, blue tiny flowers on a leafless weed, carapace, skeleton of crab, snail shell, pulsations of order in the bellies of minnows, order swallowed, broken down, transferred through membranes to strengthen large orders. I would like to stop there. I think most of you have seen minnows or tiny little fish darting around at the edges of lakes. And one of the things that is really amazing about tiny fish, which he notices, which we notice, but we are not poets, and so I think maybe notice them, but don't somehow notice them. You can see into the bellies of little fish. You can actually see through them. Unlike the fish we had in Elizabeth Bishop, which was gray and white and the flesh coming off like strips of wallpaper. These are little fish, and he, walking along the coast, along the shore here, he can see in their bellies how they break down plankton into themselves. He can see their digestive tracts. He doesn't need an X-ray machine. It's there, visible through their skin is so thin and they are so small that he can see inside them. So he can see smaller orders and things feeding on things. But in the large view, no lines or changeless shapes. So there are no lines. There are just U's here. There are things going into other things. They're working in and out together and against millions of events. The plankton eat the algae. The minnows eat the plankton. The minnows are eaten by larger fish. There are millions of events working in and out together and against millions of events, so that I make no form of formlessness. It just goes on. It just happens this way. As I said, Wallace Stevens says, happens to like is one of the things that happens to fall. One of the ways things happen to fall. So we can summarize what's happened. The fish has eaten the minnow, which has eaten the plankton, which had eaten the algae. Orders as summaries, as outcomes of actions override or in some way result, not predictably. So one thing leads to another, and we can see the culmination of those things, but we don't know how it is all working. And then this wonderful, wonderful parenthesis, seeing me gain the top of a dune, the swallows could take flight, some other fields of bayberry could enter fall berryless. Just happens this way. And if I walked up this hill, maybe the birds would say, oh, he's coming, and wheel away and fly to another bayberry patch. And these bayberries would be spared. It just happens this way. And there is serenity because it's not planned. That's why it's serene, colon. The serenity is that the violence in the world, the need to survive, the breaking down inside the belly of the minnow, all of this just happens. No arranged terror, right? Risk is full, every living thing in siege, demand is life to keep life. No arranged terror, no forcing of image, plan, or thought, no propaganda, no humbling of reality to precept. Precept is an idea you already have. No, things happen as they happen, and nothing is arranged. It just is there in hues and shadings. Terror pervades, right? Risk is full, every living thing in siege, the demand is life to keep life. Terror pervades, but is not arranged. You could go to the top of the dune and the birds would fly off and the berries would be saved, or not, and the berries would be eaten. It just happens. All possibilities of escape open, no route shut, right? Because there are no boxes. It all shades into something else, except in the sudden loss of all routes. And that sudden loss, I think, is probably death. All routes are closed off in death. Right? I see narrow orders. Well, yeah, there are bayberries there and rushes and reeds there and water there, but will not rush to that easy victory. Still around the looser, wider forces work, the forces that are larger than he can comprehend. I will try to fasten into order enlarging grasps of disorder. I'll try to take the disorder, the bayberry bushes or the birds or whatever there is that I see, and I'll try to make order of them, but widening scope, I'll take in more. I will not narrow down unto what I can see clearly, but enjoying the freedom that, capital S, scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. A great ending. American, I think I've said this before, American writing tends to end this way, right? The rose walden ends, the sun is but a morning star. Uh, Huck Finn ends, they go light out for the territories. I can't stand civilization. I've been there before. So he goes outward into a new dawn and a new land. Even Gone with the Wind, that old Hayburner says, tomorrow is another day, is the end of that. So nothing is complete. Scope eludes my grasp. Everything is shadings. When we think we've got it and we think we've got a solution, we're wrong, because we're in the world of thought and not the world of sensing the world and its immense diversity and the fact that it's full of disorder. The disorder has an order. There are patches of berries. There are schools of birds, whirling in the air that have a shape. It's a flock of birds, and yet we cannot determine the position of any bird within it. And so the world is continually new for us. Scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I perceive nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. So I've ended a little early. I think what he's trying to cope with in this poem is that the world will not cohere into something nice and neat and that can be contained in a box or within lines, that there's always disorder, that the field always has a moving center, that formlessness triumphs always over form. We have form, but it always morphs into something more, just like the Corson's Inlet and the creek flow into the ocean, into something larger. There's always something larger that can't be comprehended. So I'm going to end there. That's the last line of poem. If I have favorite lines in poetry in the last 20 years, 30 years, that's them. I perceive nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. Now here, if you want these two of these other walking around poems, I've written about them actually. So you can, if you type my name in, Rilke Duino, into Google, you'll get a long essay on the Duino elegy, number 9, which I think is one of the great, I can't say how great it is, one of the great poems of all time, even if I'm not sure I always agree with it. And I think another of the great poems of all time is the first book of the Prelude, and I've written about that too. And you can type Huck Gutman Wordsworth Prelude into Google. I wasn't going to write about that. That's a pretty long poem. It's like 450 pages. And I bought a copy of the Prelude illustrated for my son in Seattle. I found it in a bookstore. It's a beautiful book. And I gave it to him. I thought, he ain't going to know how to read this poem. It's very difficult and strange. I used to teach it to freshmen, and I think they didn't know what I was doing. But I thought it was so wonderful a poem. So I actually went through book 1 and tried to talk to my son in this long letter about Wordsworth's first book of the Prelude. And then this is where I'll end. I have a web page. I